You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for the top wines and spirits of the world at vintmarketplace.com. As always, I'm joined by Billy Lanco, who is coming back from Napa from his stage 1 MW exam. How'd it go, Billy?
Yeah, I'm actually still here recording on site. I think it went pretty well. Definitely wasn't perfect, but definitely could have gone a lot worse. There's a lot of things that you always wish you could do better in hindsight. Time management on my tasting part would have been a lot better. I think I made a few mistakes there because of that, but hopeful that the gestalt, as one of the MWs says, is overall good, and they'll look fondly upon that. I think my theory went pretty well, so we shall see. But coming out of it optimistic, and if for whatever reason I have to go on and take stage 1 again, I'm very prepared. So that's also exciting. So I'm looking forward to the next step, but we don't hear till September. I don't know if they tell us the wines before. So I have the summer to basically take a break, I guess. Some people say take a break, and then you can start preparing again for the next year. But if I do magically get into stage 2, I need to basically start studying again pretty soon, because there's a lot to cover there.
I mean, I'm sure like any of those sort of exam structures, learning how the exam actually works, and you can be told about it and even do a few, but repetition of the process is also helpful, kind of like the SATs, right? Like learning how to do the exam well versus just the knowledge portion is one component.
Yeah, a billion percent. Weirdly enough, funny you mentioned the SATs. I actually took the SATs every year since 7th grade before taking it for college. So I completely agree about the repetition on that. Really helped me.
I had the opposite experience. I took the SAT, got one score, and then I remember I took SAT prep, like the class that they teach you how to do it. And I got lower in every category. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I honed in my study skills in the last month and a half. So I wish I would have studied that efficiently the whole time. So that would have helped. And then I came down with an illness over the past month that was heavy congestion and lethargy. So luckily that didn't impact my theory studying, but I wasn't really able to taste as much as I would have liked. And I don't think that impacted actually me identifying wines. I think what that, to your point, impacted me of doing practice flights in time conditions, because I was just I'm not going to consume alcohol right now or taste alcohol. But yeah, no, overall excited for what's to come, and I'm excited for the summer here. I'm also excited for our guest today, Charles Curtis, Master of Wine. This was actually interesting. We got connected through my work at Fine Vintage we had James Kluwer on here a while back, Master of Wine. He teaches for them in New York. He also just consults across the globe, but he had some really interesting insights on Champagne and on Burgundy, his 2 specialties that he writes for Decanter and judges and does a bunch of things for. So excited for that. And we have news that actually correlates perfectly with our guest, which doesn't often happen. So that's cool too.
Yeah. Do you want to get into the Vint Marketplace news, and then we'll talk more about Charles and his maps and his work in Champagne and Burgundy?
For sure. So news number 1, I just think it was a really interesting article. Wanted to share with the group that, Louis Roederer came out with a new line of Brut Nature champagne. And I think we've been banging on this podcast for a while about how Brut Nature is becoming a thing because grapes and champagne are getting riper and riper. But I think it's just interesting to continue to watch these big champagne houses present these wines in different ways and try to figure out, I feel like they're almost grappling with this change in public. I feel like they just keep talking about it and want to just talk it out with someone. So they came out with their 2018 Brut Nature Blanc and Rosé. They updated the packaging, and they have this whole spiel about why this wine's really good and why they're trying out with this micro vinification of 45 plots. It was really interesting, and it makes me want to try these wines and sit them next to some of their other vintages and see how the differences stand out.
Yeah, the interesting line from the article was talking about how it's I'll just read it. It says, it's almost like it's an attempt to practice run climate change and exercise for the team to prove they can adapt to the shorter, hotter growing seasons that will become the norm in Champagne sooner rather than later. So I thought that was just an interesting way to frame the project.
Yeah, doesn't it feel like they're just like literally thinking through this out loud? Like I feel like they're just this is like an internal meeting. Yeah.
Yeah, and the repackaging and sort of like this is good stuff, which I'm sure it is, but it's like the positioning is like almost like convincing themselves and everyone that this is the way of the future, which it very well may be. Not knocking it at all. I just think it's like you said.
No, I think it's gonna be good, but I don't know if you've looked at their previous Brunator ones though. It's like this artist was like avant-garde, and the previous bottles almost look like a one-off like artsy piece. They were kind of like, I don't know, they were colorful. They had like weird type. Like it was like it looked like it was supposed to be like a one-off fanciful type thing. And I think they realized they're going to need to keep making these. So they were like, crap, we need to make these look a little bit more serious because like actual champagne people aren't going to buy these. Like the top copy on the old labels almost looks like a Harry Potter font or something. So.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at here now. It is like that's right. It's a Harry Potter font. Yeah. Fortunately, that sort of styling moves champagne down market in people's minds, right?
Exactly. I think that you don't go through a full rebrand. This line isn't that old. You don't go through a full rebrand. I've had to do these for wine companies before. So you don't do that unless you like actually have a business reason behind it after that too. I thought that was fascinating. And then the other article, so that touches on the champagne for Charles Curtis. But then we also had a really cool post about prices. I guess it's not that cool actually. Prices in Burgundy of the land continue to rise. They continue to break records. They rose on average, I guess, 11% over the past year. And yeah, Burgundy just doesn't have like a sign of, looks like it's going to be getting cheaper, at least from a land point of view anytime soon.
Yeah, I was talking to someone about that the other day when we were discussing why wines from the region are so expensive and just the shortage of like there's nowhere else to plant functionally.
Yeah.
If you want to pick up a vineyard, you're going to pay a price. And I think we talked about this last year, or maybe we talked about it the year before, but it's definitely a continuing trend. 11% in appreciation on like land in any region, regardless of if it's a vineyard plot or not, is pretty substantial.
Yeah. So you're right. We talked about this last year and possibly 26 years before that. This is the 28th year in a row with the average price rise.
There you go.
And it's rising above €1 million. That is not even just dollars per hectare. And a hectare is about 2.5 acres, give or take, for us American listeners. But it's interesting is, and this article touches on it too, it's juxtaposed with the rest of France, where a lot of regions are seeing vine pool schemes because of lower consumption of the lower market wines. So things below like $10, below 15, especially below $10, are just seeing less demand than they had in the past. So they're literally pulling out those vineyards, but then doubling down on some of these vineyards that are known to produce these quality wines. So we will see how this continues over the years. Maybe this bodes well for me finally owning a vineyard at some point in time somewhere.
There you go.
So that is the news today. And speaking of, I guess, the regions of Burgundy and Champagne, Charles Curtis has done a really, really cool kind of deep dive previous to their actual codification in the system that they have now. So it's a really cool deep dive into the region. And then he also has a really fantastic book on vintages of Champagne from late 1800s all the way through basically the time of publication. So that was fascinating. A lot of detail on each. And as a process of that, he worked with Steve DeLong to create these awesome new maps. I don't know if anybody remembers that Peter Lean talked about these maps. They were kind of the gold standard of Champagne maps that were created right basically just after World War II. When we used to be on YouTube, if you want to go back, I had one behind me on my wall in my bedroom. And it was funny. I mentioned that on the call, and Curtis was like, yeah, well, it's the old one. We're making these new ones and they're going to be the same quality, but just modern day and even better. So it's going to be cool since there hasn't been a new addition to this map world for like 80 plus years. So that'll be neat. And he also talks about a new project that he's working on, a book to come out next year, which I also can't wait for.
Yeah, you can go to DeLong Wine. So that's DE and then LONG wine.com. You can see the full collection of maps that Steve and Charles worked together on. Steve's an excellent cartographer, designer, and the maps are beautiful. Yeah, you can get them in large prints to be able to hang up in your house. And then they have all kinds of charts and maps and other things. Yeah, so before we get into our conversation with Charles Curtis, make sure to check out our online wine and spirit store at vintmarketplace.com, where you can find all of the cult classics from Bordeaux to Barolo, a ton of classic champagne as well. All of the niche producers that your favorite somms are drinking. We have one of the largest selections of inventory in the US and some of the most competitive pricing for enthusiasts and collectors. You can be sure that the Vint Marketplace is your go-to shop for stocking your wine cellar. And now, without further ado, here is Charles Curtis, Master of Wine.
All right. We are here with very special guest, Charles Curtis, MW. Thanks so much for joining today.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, I've seen your name all through the wine publications, especially on Decanter, and then we got connected through Fine Vintage. So really excited to have you on. Could you give a little background maybe on your path into wine and how it's evolved over time and how you got to be where you are today?
Sure. I got into wine because I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do. Very straightforward. I trained as a chef and I worked in restaurants for 13 years, always in the back of the house, never on the floor. And then in the course of the 13 years, I got married and had a kid. And as soon as you have a kid, you realize that actually restaurant work is maybe not the best career path for you. So I decided to get out of it. And that really drove me insane at the time because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And then one day out of the blue, it just hit me. I could sell wine to restaurants because I know guys who work in restaurants and it seemed like a good idea. So I started on the wholesale side. I did 7 years with a couple different wholesalers. And then I did 7 years with the Moet Hennessy, which when I joined them was still called Clico Inc. And then I did 4 years with Christie's auction houses, head of department, first in New York, then in Hong Kong. And for the last more than 12 years, I've been working for myself. My interest in wine has grown over time.
Something that I thought was really interesting with your background, going from the restaurant and going out, I feel like the restaurant is very disparate from the wine auction space. You don't rarely see people going from one to another. How did you end up getting connected with Christie's and then also spanning such different markets? Hong Kong's completely different than North America.
Or it was a long process to get from working in a kitchen to being head of department at Christie's. And the way it started was I began as a sort of rank and file salesman selling wine to restaurants. I was successful. Apparently I could convince people to do stuff even if I didn't know what I was talking about. So the first couple years, I had absolutely no idea what I was saying. So I would just go into accounts and make stuff up. And then I got to New York. I got recruited to work at a distributorship in New York. And I started calling on the 7 retail accounts in Manhattan. And I learned about the WSET, to be honest with you. And I thought, oh, that's cool. Maybe I won't have to make stuff up anymore. So I took the classes. I literally started at level 1 and did all the levels. And I never really expected to get to the end of it, but I thought I'll just take these classes till they kick me out. And they never kicked me out. So I did levels. They were called different things back then. This was in the 90s. And then I thought, yeah, I'll do diploma. Who knows? I probably won't pass. I gave it a shot and I passed. And then they said, oh, are you going to do the MW? And I never really had an ambition to be an MW, but I thought, hey, they haven't tossed me out yet, so might as well give it a shot. So I started doing the MW program, and that was 2001. 2002 in June, I sat the exam and got the tasting. Then I sat the exam again because I didn't pass the theory, and I got the theory the second time up. And then I wrote my dissertation. That whole time I was working for Moet Hennessy. By then, Clico Inc. and Shefflin and Somerset had merged to make Moet Hennessy US. And they were very supportive. They wanted an MW on staff. And I convinced them when I was in the course of studying before I passed that what they should do is make a new post for me that didn't exist at the time, which was Director of Wine and Spirit Education. They went for it. They made this job up, which didn't really exist. I figured out later, actually, they didn't even have a line item in the budget for it. They just told me, whatever expenses you run up, just put them on your expense account. And I said, well, what's my expense account? And they said, well, if you go over it, we'll tell you. So I literally started this department from scratch, wrote all the curriculum, did all the presentations for 4 years, put everything on my expense account. And it went well, and they were happy. And I had a vision of going from there to because it seemed like it was going well, and let me do it for 4 years. So I thought, hey, this kind of works. Maybe they'll do it globally and make me the head of it, and I can move to Paris with my family. That was like my vision. They didn't share my vision. They're like, yeah, you're doing a good job. We like you. You can stay as long as you want. We'll give you a raise every year, but it will be incremental. Then I realized I had put myself in a non-revenue producing unit, and it was like glass ceiling time. So I heard Christie's was recruiting for a head of department, and I thought I would talk to them. It turns out they also wanted an MW. And at the time, Michael Broadbent, who's my idol, was still very much involved. He's an MW, and they wanted an MW. And so even though I didn't have a lot of background in valuation or the auction market, I'd been a customer of Christie since the 90s, because I was buying wine for myself, just for me to drink, not even for clients. But I would show up so they knew who I was. And I went through the whole interview process, and I ended up, the last step was interview with my client to fly to London and meet with Michael. And we had a long chat over lunch, and he said, I suppose you'll be okay. Just keep your head down and work, and you should get through it. So that was the start of my career at Christie's, and that was fun. I ran the sale room in New York, which at the time was the biggest. At the time, Christie's was the largest wine auction house in the world, and the New York sale room was the busiest sale room. They also did sales in Amsterdam, Geneva, London, of course. At that time, they were not doing them in Asia. Then in 2008, they changed the laws in Asia, and in Hong Kong specifically, they removed excise tax from wines. Christie's, they started up again with this really great sale that was direct from the cellars of Chateau Latour, because the guy who owns Christie's and the guy who owns Latour are one and the same. François Pinot. And so I went to that first sale or the restarting of the department in Asia. And then from then I went to every sale in Asia. And after the market really took off, I don't know if you remember '08, but '08 kind of sucked because it was the financial crisis. It was a really terrible time for anybody with money, and the people that had wine were no exception. So it was really, really a struggle. But then with the demand from Hong Kong picking up tremendously, it's pulled the collectible wine market up by the bootstraps, and it really saved us. We were in the doldrums for probably, I don't know, 4 months, 5 months, but really that was it. And after that, it was going really well. And that was buoyed by demand from Asia. So eventually Christie said, this is all going really well, but we want you to go to Hong Kong and set up a permanent department based in Hong Kong and hire the staff to do it from there directly. And that was 2010. So I went to Hong Kong in 2010. I was there 10, 11, 12, and that was really good, except my wife didn't come with me. That was a drag. And after a couple of years of living in Hong Kong as she was still in New York, I realized I could probably either keep my job or I could keep my wife, but I probably couldn't keep both. And so I opted for the wife. It was the right decision, and we're still happily married. It is now 33 years and counting. And so that's when I decided to go to work for myself.
Yeah, so you went from a blank check expense account at Moet Hennessy to working for yourself now. Do you still have that same bear no expense approach to your current business?
That's a very interesting question, because you know what I always say about working for yourself, I wouldn't have it any other way, but the boss is really an asshole. I still get to do whatever I want. In fact, I roll bigger now than I did before. But you just have to figure out how to make things work. It's the life of a freelancer. And instead of, putting on a suit and going to one office every day and doing whatever they want you to do, you're working for yourself. there's a lot of moving pieces. I always say that being a consultant means working for anybody who's going to pay you, which is true. But I get to work on a lot of different projects. If I don't like the clients, I don't have to work with them. And it's fun and exciting. And there's endless variety. And yeah, now I'm spending probably, it depends, usually around 20 weeks a year in France, in Burgundy and Champagne. And I managed to eat pretty well and drink pretty well, so things are good.
Yeah. Are there particular projects that, just say over the last couple of years, that you've been most focused on in your consulting work, apart from book projects and other things, but just the consulting work? It's interesting.
So the consulting work is working with private clients who are buying and selling rare wines at auction. It's interesting work. I like working with private clients. Usually they're wealthy people who like to drink wine, and that kind of with me. That's always been the majority of my revenue. I've been making more money from other things in recent years, so now it's probably 50% of my revenue. And at least it was in 2024. This year, we'll see. This year, I have more irons in the fire. But yeah, some of them are buying, some of them are selling. They have all different needs. Every consultant client wants or needs something different. Some are just building a collection and they don't really have a big collection yet. Some have a gigantic collection and they need me to inspect the wine that they bought without looking at it to make sure it's right. Some are worried about fake wine. Some are looking to use the wine as a collateral for a loan, and then I have to inspect it and appraise it for the banks. And everybody has a different motivation for hiring a consultant. And so it's fun working with different people and doing different things.
When you're inspecting it, are you predominantly, aside from the potential fakes, are you looking just for quality to see signs of like storage and how well the wine has been maintained?
Yeah, I have inspected wine at most of the principal wine storage facilities around the world. So depending where their wine is, I usually have a pretty good idea how it's been stored. Almost all my clients store professionally. There's a few guys with smaller collections that store at home. And I've been to their residences to check out the way they have it stored. If somebody has a lot of money invested in wine, I usually advise them to store professionally, just because then you have traceability and you have a paper trail of what the temperature's been. And those places are usually like the Fort Knox of wine. And so if somebody's got $1 million or more of wine, I tell them that they should think about storing professionally. Not to say they shouldn't have a cellar at home so they can have some stuff to drink. Especially nowadays, most of the professional storage places can deliver wine to you pretty rapidly. Shouldn't be too much of an obstacle to making it work. Usually, again, it depends on some clients I buy wine for and I've never seen their stocks, and other people want me to go regularly and inspect their wines. And so it really depends on the needs of the individual client and how big the collection is.
My wife is Taiwanese and we have more interaction with the Asian market than I used to over time. Do you still have clients over there, and have you seen a change in kind of the approach to wine from the Asian market?
I love Taiwan. It's one of my favorite countries anywhere. And I was in Taiwan last year and I was in Hong Kong this year. So I still actually have several Taiwanese clients, and I don't have any active clients currently in Hong Kong. I was spending a lot of time in Hong Kong pre-pandemic. So from the time I came back from Hong Kong until the start of the pandemic, I was spending like 4 to 6 weeks a year in Hong Kong, mostly inspecting wine at Crown Wine Cellars and the Acker Warehouse, etc. And since then, during the pandemic, obviously couldn't go. And then after that, my clients felt less compelled to have me go and inspect wine for them. I went in January of this year because I had a client who was selling wine and I wanted to go to see the Pearl of Burgundy tasting and reconnect with clients I hadn't seen for a while. And it was fun, but the mood of the market was different. So my general take on Hong Kong in January of this year was that everything seemed really lively and there were a lot of people out. It was still tough to get a restaurant reservation, that everybody was opening nice bottles of wine. So that that from that perspective, it didn't change that much. But then I went to the sale my client had, and it was a different crowd of people. They were buying different things, spending different amounts of money. And I think my takeaway was that the market has really evolved a lot. One of the things that I have always noticed about Asia, and it's still definitely very true, is that they've been very successful at cultivating young buyers, which Americans haven't done. America is still the biggest market, or has been the biggest market. So Hong Kong was bigger right after they took the taxes away. So 2008, 2009, 2010, there was more fine wine sold in Hong Kong than there was in New York. But after Xi Jinping came into power, that kind of changed. U.S. regained ascendancy, and since then, the U.S. has been the largest market. Despite that, in the U.S., we've had trouble recruiting young people to drink fine wine. There's young people, like my daughter, for example, they drink plenty, but they don't drink the stuff that we drink, and it's a very different thing. Whereas when you go to the sale room in Hong Kong, it's packed with young people who are really dying to experience the best fine wine. So to me, that's super admirable. But when I say the market has matured, what I mean is that when I lived in Asia, it was almost like a social event, and there was almost an element of showmanship to going to the auction. You wanted to be lifting your paddle and have everybody see how much you were spending. And now the collectors there are very savvy, and they don't bother to do that. They put in absentee bids, which is what Americans and the Brits have been forever. It's the smartest way to buy, because then you set a limit, put in your bid, and either you get it or you don't get it. And what you realize is that there's always going to be another auction. There another one next week. There are sales almost every week. And so the market has matured, but they have a crop of young people that I think is really encouraging. But despite those sort of positive signs, I think prices were very soft when I was there in January, and the market is not inexhaustible. And who knows, with the current economic uncertainties around the globe, what's going to happen going forward. Hopefully I'll still have a role in Asia. I love going to Asia. Last year, November, I went to the Decanters Fine Wine Experience in Singapore, and Singapore was really good. But that was a brutal commute, because I was in Burgundy tasting, and I had to go up to Paris, fly to Singapore, do my event, and the next day I came back. So that was a little exhausting. So this year I'm doing the Fine Wine Encounter as well, but I'm doing it in London, which is a much easier commute from Burgundy. So we'll see what happens.
That's really cool. I think that on our podcast, we don't get to talk a ton about the Asian markets, but I don't think folks realize just how influential they have been at various points in the last 2-3 decades. And obviously still are, like you said, and a lot of money sloshing around over there as well. Floodgates can always reopen, of course.
I think the foundations of the markets in Asia have shifted over time. At the beginning, when I was living there, a lot of it was gifting. People would buy fancy wines and use them as gifts when they're trying to close a business deal or something like that. And people were not always buying to drink. There were a lot of traders, and there were a lot of people who were buying to either to resell or to give away as a present. And a lot of the trade buyers have dried up. There was always a lot of interest from mainland China. And so when I lived there, I would go to mainland a couple times a month. And I haven't been to mainland China since last time it was like 2018. It was even before the pandemic. And demand there has really dried up. It stayed relatively solid in Hong Kong, and Taiwan is a good market, and Singapore is a good market and getting even better. But mainland China is not nearly as robust as it used to be.
Let's fly back over to France, and maybe we can talk about your book project that you released in 2014, the original Grand Crus of Burgundy. That's what was a pretty deep undertaking. It seems like, just going through, looking at pre-AOC and discussion of how they thought through the classification system in Burgundy over time. And you surveyed a couple hundred years of history, no? If not more, to put together that volume. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Once you become an MW, you always want to write a book. And I actually had a couple other projects that I wanted to do before I wrote the Burgundy book, and neither of them panned out. At first I wanted to do a book on champagne, and eventually I did, obviously, in 2020. I was glad, in retrospect, I'm very glad I waited, because the book I wrote in 2020 was way cooler than the one I would have written in 2008. So that worked out, but it was frustrating. And then when I was head of department at Christie's, I wanted to write a book on Bordeaux, because when I was at Christie's, Bordeaux was still king. Well, the auction market's not anymore. It's much more about Burgundy. And I shopped an idea for a Bordeaux book around for a long time. And in those days, I used to go every year to the premier tasting in Bordeaux, and I was deeply involved in that, and the member of the Commandery de Bordeaux, and went to all the dinners, and it was really my thing. But as I was living in Hong Kong, I saw the market changing, and I saw people were getting more and more interested in Burgundy. And so I was teaching on the MW seminar one year, and there was a guy, another MW, Joel Butler. He might know Joel. Anyhow, Joel had a copy of this book that was written in 1855 by Dr. Laval. And he said, "Charles, why don't you have this? I don't read French, and you do, so it might make some sense to you." So I had Laval's book, and that was like 2012. And I picked through it, and I realized that a lot of it was about the planting practices and the growing practices back in the 19th century, which has nothing to do with the way wine is grown today, because it was all pre-phylloxera. So the whole system was completely different. So I found that whole part to be irrelevant. But they had this section of Laval's book that was about writing about each of the different villages and what the best vineyards in them were and who the proprietors of those vineyards were. And I thought, this part is cool. So I started translating it chapter by chapter. And then I thought, oh yeah, maybe I'll make a book out of this. But then I found Dr. Morlow's book and started translating that. At this time, I was writing a blog online and just posting it gradually. But I just kept chipping away at it, adding more books. And over time, it got, as books do, it expanded. And then I was getting ready to leave Christie's, and I thought, okay, I got to finish this thing. So that first year that I was independent, I really devoted a lot of time to finishing up the book. And it was really good. Somebody once said to me, "Charles, you wrote the perfect toilet book, because you can take it and read like a little bit and then put it down and then go back to it later." And it's a very geeky kind of thing. But the thing I like about that book is that it's like an evergreen sort of topic that's never going to go it's never going to get dated, because it's all about stuff that happened over 100 years ago. So how can it get dated? It's already dated. So yeah, that was my first experience with writing a book. And that really was the transitional stage for me from being a guy who was mostly about Bordeaux to a guy who was mostly about Burgundy. And then when I've started consulting, most of my clients were big Burgundy collectors. And that's when I started spending a gigantic amount of time in Burgundy.
Very cool. That book sounds right up my alley. I'm going to have to get a copy. It reminds me of the Story of Wine by Hugh Johnson. It's kind of the same way. It's like you can flip to anywhere in the past, and you can just dive right in for a little snippet.
Right. Except that Hugh is a much better writer than I am. But
well, it's all right. I'm sure you're great, and your topic is fascinating. It'll be great. But moving on to modern day Burgundy, so since you've been spending time there, I feel like people have said it's evolved over time, but at the same time hasn't changed that much. What have you seen over the past maybe 5 or 10 years, especially as maybe some of these younger producers are coming into control of their family domains?
Right. That's what happens over time, is that there's always a new generation coming up, and there's different ways of thinking about grape growing, thinking about winemaking, thinking about aging. And from the time that I started going there, my first visit was in 1990. And then in the 90s, Burgundy was very different. Everybody was, obviously, the climate was completely different. The wines in Burgundy were completely different. The practices in the vineyard, everybody was looking for extraction. They wanted as much color as they could get. They wanted as much concentration as they could get. And now with global warming, the aim is almost the opposite. It's to not overdo things and to let the fruit speak for itself. And there's been a lot of techniques that have been developed, and picking times, the idea that the thoughts on picking times have evolved. The thoughts on extraction have changed. In the 90s, pretty much everybody was destemming everything. And now there's people that are doing some whole cluster, mostly whole cluster. And so the techniques have changed. Back then, everybody loved to use new oak when they could afford it. And now people are starting to use less and less new oak and have a more reasoned approach to the aging of the wines. And everything has been evolving over time, but it's interesting evolution to see. And I think with global warming, really everything is evolved, but the vines themselves seem to be adapting to the conditions. The winemakers are adapting to it, and the grape growers, in that they're finding techniques to deal with much hotter temperatures. And the consumers are adapting as well, because the wines that we're seeing coming out of Burgundy today are nothing like the wines that I was getting when I first started going there in the early 90s.
Along with climate change, I know areas like the Haute Côte de Beaune and the Haute Côte de Nuit are becoming plantable, more fashionable in general. Do you see like a shifting of or ever a reclassification of anything that's like a Premier Cru or a Grand Cru, like diminishing in status or improving based on how the weather is changing? Or is it really just the total package of the terroir that makes it what it is?
So Burgundy, unlike Bordeaux, has been adapting their classification system very, very slowly, but they have been doing it over time. And there's always stuff coming up. That's one of the things I love about Burgundy, is that they're always thinking about it and they're always adapting. But I don't think that the major motive behind that is climate change, at least not yet. And it might be eventually, but I don't see a wholesale change anytime soon. I definitely see things continuing to evolve in individual places, but the whole process is incredibly complicated, and it usually takes about 20 years or so for anything to happen. But you probably saw that last year, the Puy-Locher and Puy-Basel got some Premier Crus, and the year before that, we got some Premier Crus, and next in line is going to be Marsanais will get some Premier Crus, probably. That's not a done deal yet, but it looks like it's a pretty solid bet. And then there's other things that are a little bit more of a long shot, like will Les Saint-Georges ever get promoted to Grand Cru? It's an open question. I like to think it will, but politically it might not be the right thing. So those are all things that have been in the works for decades, literally decades. And the push behind them was not because of global warming. It was just, it's much more long-term than that. So I think it will continue to evolve over time, but it's not going to be an overnight thing. And it probably won't be just one cause. It will have to be because everybody in the appellation has to agree if there's going to be a change. And you don't get people jumping on board unless it's solidly in everybody's benefit.
It's hard to say value and Burgundy in the same sentence, but how much do you think can collectors think about classification, and maybe even historical ways of doing classification as a way to identify, call it up and comers or value in Burgundy? Is there a correlation there, or can you speak to the relationship maybe?
I really don't think you have to put quotes around value when it comes to Burgundy. I think there's really great value Burgundies out there, and I love to find them. Just the example that I was just giving is a perfect example. The new Diag Climat in Marsanais that are about to be promoted to Premier Cru. You just have to know where these things are and what to find. I just wrote a thing for Decanter. It just came out a couple issues ago on undervalued Premier Crus, which are Premier Crus that some people would say are as good as a Grand Cru. And then there are village level appellations that are as good as Paul Cruz. I think you find that stuff all over. But the thing about Burgundy is there's a lot of climat. So you need to be familiar with a wide range of them to figure out which ones are good value, quote unquote, good value, and which ones aren't. But I see a ton of value out there, everywhere from Chablis down to the Mâconnais, including the Côte d'Or, and not just in the Haute Côte. I love going up to the Haute Côte. It's fantastic. I have appointments in the Haute Côte in a couple of weeks. So I'm totally down with that. But I don't think you have to go there. I think you can stay in the main part of the Côte d'Or and still find stuff that's crazy good value. It depends how you define crazy good value. But for me,
Sure.
a really solid wine that's less than $50 a bottle is falling into that category. And you can find stuff, for example, if you go down to the Mâconnais, you can find stuff under $30 a bottle that's smoking good. So I think there's definitely, and that's pretty much within everybody's reach. And of course, the other thing that you can do is what I did. I convinced Decanter to let me cover Beaujolais. Beaujolais, some people say, is part of Burgundy. The Burgundians in the Côte d'Or are not necessarily on board with that statement, but the grape is different, soil is different, it's in a different department. But it's close by, and there's some really cool stuff going on in Beaujolais too. So I like this. So now I'm covering for Decanter everything from Chablis down to Beaujolais.
And you're obviously going to spend a lot of time there, and more time drinking Burgundy than probably even widely across the region than many collectors would. Where else outside of Burgundy do you have your eyes on in terms of Pinot Noir?
Champagne. Totally. My next book is on champagne topics. So I'm seriously involved in champagne. I'm not sure they grow Pinot Noir outside of Burgundy and Champagne season. Of course they do. I like the Burgunders from Germany. In fact, I have visits in Germany next month too, that I'm really looking forward to. Going to dinner in the Black Forest, so that should be cool.
Oh, wow. Nice. 80 years on from the end of the war. Cool. Well, on that note, let's transition over quickly to Champagne here. The time that we have left, you've written a book and you're writing another book. Can you briefly tell us what your initial topic was and then what the new one is about? It sounds fascinating.
So the initial one, in fact, I have a copy right here. It's called Vintage Champagne 1899 to 2019. So it looks at 120 vintages. And that was my initial impetus for writing it. That's what I thought was cool, because I'm just a dyed-in-the-wool geek. So I go through every vintage and I talk about what happened in the vintages. And that was but then I thought, okay, well, that's good, but you might want to put something about who's making vintage wine. Then I started adding producer profiles. That was like the second stage. I ended up putting in 120 different producer profiles. And then I had a very good client who said, he was talking about my first book, and he said, Charles, your book is very well written and everybody finds it very informative, but people want to know what you think. So I took that piece of advice from him. And so I rank everything in this book. I rank all the vintages, stars out of 5, and I rank all the producers, stars out of 5. And so now people know exactly what I think. Because when this was published, I was just about to turn 60, not quite 60. And I realized I'm old enough to just do whatever I want to do. So I just laid it out there. And that's what this book is about. And there are many other things of great interest, at least great interest to me in this particular book. There's a whole section at the end, an appendix, where I translated the cahier de charge, the rules for making champagne, into English, and it had never been fully translated before. So there's loads of stuff in this book, and it took forever to write. You can see how it is. It is, in fact, 549 pages, so it's really big. It was my pandemic project. Well, I started way before the pandemic, but I finished it up during the pandemic. And then I could just work 20 hours a day. My wife made me sit in the corner. We were in the same apartment. I just sat in the corner and finished this book. I had started writing it long before. And so that was cool. And then I finished that. It was still a pandemic. So I thought, okay, well, let's do another project. So I wanted to, that map that you have behind you there, Billy, I have had copies. I have copies of the originals right there in my office. I've always loved them. And I've always loved them, but I know that they're 70 years old. So I thought, well, maybe we could update them. So I rang up this guy that I knew about him, but I'd never met him personally. But during the pandemic, it was easy just to reach out. People actually answer you. So there's this guy, Steve DeLong, who's a cartographer, he's an American guy, but he's based in London. He's been there forever. And he does these wine maps. And I had bought one to use in a corporate event setting that I was doing. I had to do something on Italy, and I thought, damn, I need a map of Italy, and I didn't have a decent one. So I bought his online. It came. I thought, this is really actually a very beautiful map. I just rang Steve up and I said, you know the Larmont maps? And he said, yeah, sure. I said, do you want to redo them for Champagne? I'll do a description describing each village and the lay of the land, which we call the field guide. And so he did the maps and showed the individual UD, but it's up-to-date information instead of being 7-year-old information. So we published them as individual freestanding maps with a little booklet of commentary. And then we did one big one of the main part of the Côte de Blanc. And then we just started going crazy, and we did everything so including the Coteau de Petit Morin, the Cézanne, the Vitrière, Mongueux, all of that stuff. And we're coming out, hopefully before Christmas, with a bound volume that will be called an Atlas of the Greater Côte. And so I'm really excited about that. And I'll be, as with any book, you start out thinking, yeah, this is not going to be so bad. And then you get stuck into the project and it's really passionate and you're doing it and you're very happy. And then you get to almost the end, but not the end. And then the real work starts, like the editing and the proofreading and the typesetting. And that shit takes forever. Then in the end, you just want to be done. You just want to be over the finish line. And that's where I am now. But I'm on the final stages, and I'm hoping to have printed copies in like September.
Oh, wow. That's so soon. Are you going to have like printed versions of the maps additional with it or available for
Yeah,
purchase?
the maps are available now. So they're all on Steve's site is thelongwine.com, and all the maps are available now. And a lot of them in online editions too. So you can either buy a paper map or you can just buy the PDF, and the commentary obviously comes with it. And that's all been available for a while, including the map. That's the main part of the Côte de Blanc. So everything from Chuy to Vertu is on one gigantic map that's done in a landscape format so that it's sized like the maps that Sylvain Pitillot did of Burgundy. In fact, it's exactly the same size. So if you want to hang it right underneath, you can. And that's been up for like a year and a half now. But the bound atlas is an undertaking of a different order of magnitude. So that will hopefully be out this fall.
Nice. Well, when I move to a bigger apartment, I'll try to buy some maps to hang up. My wife, this is about the best I could do for now.
All right.
I have a question on vintage champagne. We were actually just talking about in a recent episode that Dom Perignon announced the release of its 17 and 18 vintages at the same time. What have you seen in terms of the length of time that people are keeping their vintage wines on tirage? And then have you ever seen people release 2 vintages at the same time before?
So to take it in the opposite order that you put it in, no, it's not usual for people to release 2 vintages at the same time. Although it actually, with those 2 vintages, it's a smart play because they're so totally and completely different in terms of the character of the vintage. Makes sense to me. But I've never seen them do that. I have seen on a number of occasions people release them out of order. A lot of people released their 98s before their 96s, for example, because the 96 just needed more to bottle it. That's happened with several other vintages where they release them in different orders. So that happened with the 08s being held back and the 9s and 10s coming out first. And so that's somewhat more common. In terms of the length of time on lees, I think it's one of the most interesting differentiators. I think the Grand Marque houses are still aging for extended periods on lees, and that's their hallmark. And really, nobody else but Growmark houses are set up to leave stuff on lease 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, 20 years. They've got the financial resources, the cellar space, and the flexibility to be able to do that. The smaller producers and growers, for example, are usually not aging it that long. And a lot of those guys are releasing their wines sooner. And some of them are making, as I'm sure you're aware, are making wines that come from just one vintage, but they don't put the vintage on the label because it hasn't been 36 months in bottle before it's released. That's what I always call a millésime. So it's all from one vintage, but they just don't put the vintage on the label. And sometimes they'll put something in Roman numerals on the label. That's what Pierre Paillard does, for example, with their Cuvée Les Parcelles. And they put a Roman numeral that indicates the base year of the harvest. And certain other people are releasing wines every year from the same site. For example, Filippo Nat has released Clos de Goisse almost every year. And then the Baresh brothers in Lude have started to release, they've been releasing for a long time, Le Cran, which is their top wine every single year. And I think that's smart. It's moving towards a more Burgundian conception of terroir and what it means for wine to come from a particular place. And so I think all of those trends are interesting and all of them are valid. But I think that to get back to your original question, 17 and 18 together, wow. Very, very different years. And I think then you have 19 and 20, which were cut from the same cloth as 18. Then you had 21, which was the total opposite. It was cold. It was short. And then 22 and 23, big harvest, really ripe. And then 24 back to the same model as 21. So there's been a lot of swings back and forth tied to extreme weather of one sort or another. You know, when somebody said to me at Burgundy was the only thing that's changed is now every year is a crazy year because it's either really hot or it's really cold or you get hail or you get frost. And it's due to the unpredictability of weather that's tied in part to global warming. And it will be interesting. So far, Champagne has adapted really well to new conditions and hopefully they'll continue to do so.
On the other side of the coin for Champagne, I guess, not the other side of the coin, really. Growers, I saw an article recently, I can't remember where it was from, that basically said, did grower Champagne like miss the boat? Or like it was like the special child that never was. Like basically they were saying it seemed like it was increasing in popularity and then just kind of like leveled off and now it isn't as talked about anymore. I don't know if I agree with that, but I wanted to get your take on that sentiment.
I don't think that's true, but I think it's much smaller than a lot of people realize. The people who are successful are super well known and they've all become superstars, but there's a lot of growers. Most of them sell their fruit to the big houses because it's economically much more viable and to do everything. So when you're talking about a superstar grower who has an international reputation, they have to be expert at growing the grapes. They have to be an expert at vinifying the wines, but they also have to be an expert at marketing the wines, selling the wines. It requires a route to market, which is not easy to develop if your parents didn't. Your parents just sold all the fruit to just say, oh yeah, I'm just going to bottle my own and age it. You can do that and it's possible. And there's loads of people who would harvest their own grapes, bring them to the co-op. Co-op would make the wine. And you would just slap whatever label you wanted to, put your own label on it, but it was made at the co-op. And a lot of people don't appreciate that that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about grower champagne. What you're referring to is grower champagne. My friend Tim Hall calls domain champagne. Is wines that are produced by somebody from their own grapes and made in their own cellar. And his definition of it is really somebody who has their own press, because that's when you really have control. That's actually the essential act in champagne is pressing, and the skill with the presses is a really important thing. But if you look at the entire universe of growers, there's really maybe 100 of them that have any sort of reputation at all. And of that 100, there's maybe 50 of them that are superstar level, whose wines command serious prices and they have distribution in markets throughout the world. And that's a relatively small pool when you compare it to people that domain bottle their own stuff at Burgundy, for example, there's loads more small independent Burgundian domains. But you know what I say to people? I tell them that if you go back to the 19th century, Burgundy was dominated by negociants and everything was blended in Burgundy. That's now very rarely the case. There are still negociants, and some of them are doing incredible jobs at Burgundy. But to me, Champagne today is where Burgundy was 100 years ago. It took the Great Depression to get people to domain bottle their wines in Burgundy. And it's going to take something of equal force to get champagne producers to bottle their own wines. It's incredibly complicated to do everything, all those steps from growing the grapes to selling the wine. And to incentivize people to do that, it's got to be a paradigm shattering sort of occurrence in the world of wine. And I think that's, if, for anything, that's the reason why the grower Champagne maybe did realize the potential that some people thought that it had, I think. And the other side of it is that the Grand Marque houses are actually making really good wine, my 2 cents.
Yep. That's all fair enough. I think it's also there's just not enough champagne to go around. Hard for consumers here in the States to identify those tiny producers without a little bit of help. And like you said, it's the market.
I have some help right here. It's
there we go.
on Amazon.
And there you go. How's the field guide, right?
Right, exactly. But the other part of it is that it really helps to go to Champagne because despite everything, the U.S. is a market incredibly dominated by the Grand Marque houses. They have more than 70% market share, with the co-ops and growers making up just 30% of the market. But if you go to Champagne, you'll see crazy lists of champagne and restaurants and all this stuff that you never dreamed existed. And it's a champagne lover's dream to go to Champagne. And now with the TGV, it's only 37 minutes away from Paris.
Yeah, I think it's the getting to Paris part for our friends in LA like Billy. But Billy's actually been to France recently. And you didn't get over to Champagne the last time, did you, Billy?
No, I just rode down to Burgundy. Getting to Paris is fine, especially for East Coast folks. I don't see an excuse, but the trains there are amazing. So it is a day trip. Well, awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time, Charles. This has been amazing.
Glad you had me on, and hopefully we'll connect in person sometime soon.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks.
All right. That was our interview with Charles Curtis, Master of Wine. I hope everybody really enjoyed learning more about Burgundy and Champagne. Go check out his books and stay tuned for the new one coming out next year. And this week, we will be back with another 5 questions. As mentioned in previous episodes, we're going to be doing 5 questions with each guest. So there'll be a mini episode each Friday ahead of the full episode coming out each Wednesday. And for now, that is our episode for this week. And we will be back with our next episode on Friday. Cheers.